Good afternoon. My name is Jacob Durrance, I'm Assistant Principal in Manatee County, Florida, and I'm here today to kick us off. We're going to have a nice conversation, in-depth overview of the Florida Education Finance Program. Share my screen now so we can kick this off and get started. Be joined by my colleagues, Mr. Regar, Ms. Robinson, and Ms. Watson shortly, but I'm tasked with getting us started here to really delve deep into the FEFP. So the FEFP is the Florida Education Finance Program. To begin, I'm going to review really quickly our table of contents here, some of the things that we're going to highlight for you today. Of course, the definition of terms, trying to clarify some of those concepts and phrases that we're going to be seeing this afternoon. Quick synopsis of the formula. Then we're going to move on to the politics and policies at the state and the politics and policies at the local level. Following that, we'll discuss funding in Florida, specifically investigating FEFP's relationship with Florida's economy. We'd like to kind of cross-reference and compare that with school funding, public school funding in California. And then following that, we'll move on to adequacy as the adequate provision clause that's in the Florida State Constitution, trying to understand what that means in terms of the FEFP and adequate funding for schools. And then finishing off with a discussion on fairness and equity, kind of a state versus local glimpse, investigating whether the FEFP district distribution formula is fair and equitable. So to begin, we're going to go ahead and discuss some of these definition of terms that we're going to be using. Again, the FEFP is the Florida Education Finance Program, and it's the primary mechanism for funding operating costs of Florida schools. It was adopted in 1973, and though there's been some changes along the way, this is the primary mechanism for providing funds to our K-12 public schools. The BSA is the base student allocation. This is the money that's allocated to each unit of FTE. This follows the weighting, which we'll discuss in just a moment, but FTE, as you can see on the far right here, this is the full-time equivalent primary unit of measure for education funding, but it's FTE represents the hours of instruction provided to a student. So one FTE would be one student in your school. There is a UFTE, which is an unweighted FTE, and then there's just an FTE, which is an unweighted FTE times the program factors, which is going to give us the weighted FTE. We'll look at that in just a moment. We have the DCD, which is a district cost differential. This helps fund school districts in an equitable manner. This is based on differences in county by county cost of living. And it is a proportional factor that's kind of averaged by Florida Price Level Index over the last 3 years. We have cost factors, or sometimes called program factors. These are used to supplement financing for the 4 educational programs, additional expenditures. Those 4 educational programs would be basic programs, exceptional student programs, English secondary language / intensive programs, and career education programs. And lastly, we have required local effort. This is the contribution of local school districts to the FEFP through property tax income. The DJJ, this is the Department of Juvenile Justice, as a supplement. It's given to school districts in order to supplement other sources of funding for students enrolled juvenile justice education programs within their district. We have categorical funding, which we'll view in just a moment. State funding allocations used for specific programs or specific initiatives. For example, mental health, disparity supplement, turnaround schools, school safety, transportation. And we have the SAI, the Supplemental Academic Instruction Allocation, which is used for remediation, dropout prevention, summer school programs, extended school year, and similar programs for at-risk and low-performing students. So let's get straight into this after reviewing these definitions, and let's take a look at this formula. And if you're noticing and you're looking at the formula, We want to start in the top left there where it says FTE students. So in 2022, 2023, the total FTE, or the total amount of students, total number of students in Florida public schools would be 2,983,464 students. Remember, that's a measurement of hours that they're in your school. We're going to times that by the program weights, or those program cost factors, which we'll talk about shortly. And that's what's going to give us the FTE, the weighted FTE for students. So you'll notice that the weighted FTE students is greater than the unweighted, or the FTE student count. Then we'll times that by the base student allocation, which comes from legislative branch state there, which this year's all-time is Florida's high. It's $4,587.40 per FTE. And then we have to times that by our district cost differential, which will equal our base funding. I'm not going to go through every box because we're going to kind of see this over time throughout this presentation, but these other green boxes below base funding are categorical funding. So those are those programs or initiatives that have been earmarked for a specific purpose and funding to assist those purposes. Let's discuss really quickly some factors influencing the FEFP program. You know, of course, you have your local property taxes. That would be the money from local property taxes that a county may levy, and then they'll send them to the state to then be reallocated according to the DCD. Of educational program costs, those are the costs of running educational programs. There's different levels, different costs associated with each level. We have a local cost of living. So the money to live and work in a particular school district, that's going to change the formula one way or the other for your district and the amount of funding you're going to receive from the state of Florida. Of course, the sparsity of the student population. So that would be the number of students, the number of programs, your transportation needs. All those factors together will encompass this FEFP formula. I would really like to focus a little bit more in on FTE, full-time equivalent. So let's kind of look at the definition and try to understand what is an FTE. What are the qualifications for FTE? You have to have a student in kindergarten through third grade or in an authorized pre-kindergarten ESE program. They're going to get about 720 hours of instruction. So that would be an EFT component. Students in 4th through 12th grade, they're going to get about 900 hours of instruction. So of course, with class size, you may have additional funding because they'll have 22 or 24 respectively in the older grades versus the K through 3 with 18 students per class. The student must be in program membership at least one day during the survey period in an approved course of study. And the student must be in attendance at least one day during the survey period or one of the 6 scheduled meetings preceding the survey period when students were in attendance at school. So this is what we're going to be looking at specifically. I want to draw your attention to that word survey period, or those words survey period, so we can really get a better understanding of what we're looking at here. As I previously mentioned, we have program cost factors and weights that when times, right, when multiplied to that unweighted FTE count, that's what gets us to that weighted FTE count. So you'll see there's 2 groups. You have a group 1, more of our basic services, so grades K through 3, grades 4 through 8, grades 9 to 12, with ESE services respectively. And then you have your group 2, English secondary language, ESE level 4 and 5, and career education. So with these program cost factors, here's kind of the number for the equation for students in K through 3. You'll see group 101, their FTE is about a 1.126. So when we times that by the total number of students in that class, that would be your total FTE for that specific class. So program cost factors are the nuanced weights associated with the cost of implementing programs to meet the needs of Florida students. Again, for example, students enrolled in K through 3, group 101, they receive an FTE of 1.126 per student. However, students enrolled in 4th through 8th grades, group 102, would receive an FTE of 1.000 per student. You put this all together, I'm going to share again, the class size may also factor in the FTE. For example, you have 18 students in classes per grades K through 3, whereas you have 18 students. When you have 18 students and you times that FTE of a 1.126 by 18, you get a total FTE for that class of 20.268, whereas 22 students in 4th grade, say, times an FTE of 1.000 would equal a total FTE for that class of 22. So there's kind of a ranging or a balancing effect for the different grades. Again, this is that equation I was hinting at, the first kind of 3 boxes of that FEFP formula. You have your total number of students in Florida, your unweighted FTE. Once we get that number, we'll times it by the program cost factor, so each student specific to their need. Again, groups 1 and 2, and then that's where we're going to get that total weighted FTE. And you'll notice that it is 3,277,687 weighted FTE, weighted students or weighted FTE in Florida. Again, discussing the survey periods. Here in Florida, you see the FTE reporting deadlines. Survey 1's in July with the due date of July 29th. Survey 2 is that week of October when students are in school, October 10th through 14th with the due date on the 21st. Survey 3 is in February, February 6th through 10th for this coming school year, the second semester. And then survey 4 would be in June at the year end when you're compiling your data. Just a couple of important notes here. The survey periods are meant to account for student mobility throughout the year. Those differences where you have increases in classes or decreases in student numbers. That money that's going to come with those students is going to ebb and flow according to the numbers in the classes or the numbers in FTE in those survey periods. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to our next person to continue the conversation.
Next, we will discuss FTE survey, periodic student counts. To account for student mobility throughout the school year, FTE surveys account for fluctuations in student counts. Survey data accounts for increases and decreases in student numbers. Thus, the FEFP funding ebbs and flows according to the district's FTE count. Regarding base student allocation, or BSA, the ultimate goal is to come to an understanding of base funding. It notes the amount of money allocated to each FTE, and minimally it should be based on the previous year's BSA, including the appropriate increase that will reflect any program needs or inflation. In practice, is often backed into, in other words, it's calculated after most other FEFP program funding decisions have been made. And as a result, it is often increased or decreased based on available funding rather than actual cost. Regarding the 2022-23 school year, the BSA was set for $4,587.40. And this chart here just gives a little bit more information on how BSAs are determined, just looking across districts. Some of the factors include unweighted, funded weighted, times funded, weighted, and district cost, and ultimately gives that amount of the base funding. Regarding BSA trends, over the years, it has been noted that there have been some trends when you look at these numbers in comparison from year to year. We're looking at 2012-2013 school year. The BSA was $3,582.98. As you notice, looking at the following year, the BSA amount increased, and it continued to increase across the subsequent years, all the way up to 2022-23, where it was previously noted that the BSA was $4,587.40. And so now we're going to just look at FEFP sources of revenue. And here is an example visual aid. So you will see at the top, it is that amount of the 100% FEFP. And then the breakdowns of the different percentages and how those different amounts are allocated depending upon state, local, and federal. Next, we'll talk about politics and policies, specifically regarding the state. In this section, we will give a brief summary of the FEFP policy. We'll discuss some of the controversies and even lawsuits. So, regarding the policy of FEFP, as an overview, it started as Article 9, Section 1 with the Florida Constitution. And in 1973, the Florida legislature enacted the Florida Education Finance Program, otherwise known as FEFP, in 1973, once again. Equitable access. FEFP is the method for supporting public education. And what happens during this method is that each student in Florida has equitable access to programs and services. This is a major goal of the FEFP policy. Continuing talking about equitability, each component of the FEFP equation does attempt to adjust the education funding, and the goal of adjusting is to actually meet those specific needs and conditions accounted for in all of Florida's 67 counties. The responsiveness regarding existing equation components can be amended. New components may be added, and unpopular or old components can also be deleted. So when we're talking about FEFP policy, what are the priorities of the policy? And if there are any politics, what are they? Well, regarding priorities, this may be reflected through categorical funding such as mental health, safety, transportation, teacher salary increase allocations. All of these types of funding are noted. When we look at politics, are there any political tools? That question can definitely arise. And actually, per student funding is at an all-time high in the state of Florida. However, with this being done to reflect the priority of educational and district need, it is happening in order to pulpit, or is it more of a political cause? Next, we'll discuss controversy. So there is elements that we can discuss. There are elements we can discuss regarding controversy. And this is specifically related to the district cost differential. So the what? The rising criticism. right? So critics are claiming that the DCD benefits some districts while others are at the expense of the DCD. So other districts it does not benefit. Who could that be? Well, one example is in 2017, Flagler County residents paid the 6th highest taxes in RLE and received the 3rd lowest funding per student in the state. And why? We're looking at a formula. So the DCD currently does calculate each district's price level index. A House bill also considering wage levels is looked at as well. The school recognition program, this too can be considered controversial. In 2022, lawmakers approved $200 million for the Florida School Recognition Program. Any restrictions? Well, performance recognition funds only the 55 districts that followed unmasking mandates. So there were restrictions on districts that did not follow certain mandates. And bullying, a big issue across the board in education, and that's no different here when we're discussing FEFP. One critic actually says that lawmakers are bullying local governments and school boards for protecting children. And when we look at the initial plan of the FEFP was to include the money as an FEFP category.
Okay, now we're going to take a look at lawsuits. This particular lawsuit is Citizens for Strong Schools versus the Florida State Board of Education. In overview, the petitioners claimed that Florida was failing to meet its obligations to provide an efficient and high-quality system of free public schools. The petitioner asked the courts to force the state to develop corrective action. And the petitioners claimed that this failure to offer high-quality educational opportunities unfairly affected minoritized students, low-income students, and disabled students. The petitioner's challenge was denied by the trial court, and the Court of Appeals affirmed. The court found that the claim was non-justiciable, which means that the court believes that the concerns should be left to the legislature. The Florida Supreme Court upheld that lower court's findings, and 3 Florida Supreme Court justices dissented. Now, the petitioners in this particular case were some public school students, their parents, and some private citizen organizations. The respondents were the State Board of Education, the President of the Florida Senate, the Speaker of the Florida House of Representatives, and the Florida Commissioner of Education. So this case started in 2009, and some public school students, their parents, and some citizen organizations filed suit seeking a declaration that the state was breaching its paramount duty under Article 9, Section 1A of the Florida Constitution. In their complaint, the petitioners asserted that the adequate provision and that high quality, as referenced in Article 9, Section 1, are to be measured by both the enumerated characteristics of and inputs into the systems itself, as well as the outcome results of that system. So in 2009, there was an Appropriations Act for K-12 education, and that specific item is what the petitioners said violated the education clause of the Florida Constitution. The petitioners also criticized the state's current accountability policy by saying that it misused the standardized test results, that there were inadequate graduation rates, and that it misused achievement test results. The trial court held that the arguments raised political questions that were not subject to judicial review because the relevant constitutional text does not contain judicially discoverable standards by which a court can decide whether the state has complied with organic law. The appellate court upheld that decision. So in essence, what was happening was these citizens said that high quality and efficient needed more definition. All right, it needed something quantifiable there. And the court said, that's not up to us. It's up to the legislature. It's up to the executive branch to define those things. Here is that majority opinion of the court. They said that Florida's strict separation of powers requires judicial deference to the legislative and executive branches to adopt and execute educational policies those branches deem necessary and appropriate to enable students to obtain a high quality education. Now, it's important to note that 2 justices dissented. They said that vague terms often are interpreted by the judicial branch, that efficient and high quality were 2 judicially manageable terms. The interesting thing about this case is that the door was left open to future challenges. So it'll be interesting to see if anything comes of that in the coming years. Next, politics and policies local. So some counties have additional supplements available to them. So that additional supplement is this, the 1 mil additional supplement. So Florida permits qualified electors that they can vote for an additional millage levy up to 1 mil for an ad valorem tax millage for either operational or capital expenses. Pinellas County has a local referendum effort. It is a 1/2 mil tax that Pinellas County taxpayers have voted to renew in 2008, 2012, 2016, and most recently in 2020. In 2020, the Pinellas County Schools referendum won overwhelming support, with nearly 80% of voters choosing to renew that referendum, and that was the largest margin since it was first approved in 2004. Those referendum dollars are used to boost reading, music and art programs, to provide up-to-date technology and books, and to also help recruit and retain high-quality teachers. In fact, 80% of the referendum revenue is used to supplement teacher salaries. For the 2022 and 2023 school year, each teacher received a salary supplement of $5,734 as part of their base salary. Those funds also support additional classroom libraries, additional supplies, increased training opportunities for teachers, updated computers and technology, as I mentioned before, things that fund intensive small group literacy programs, and art supplies, music and theater and dance equipment, sound systems, uniforms, and the like. Next, we'll talk about funding in Florida, and we'll investigate how FEFP's relationship is codependent and how it interplays with Florida's economy. So one of the major ways that Florida generates revenue is through tourist dollars. So in 2019, the leisure and hospitality industry accounted for nearly 6% of the state's GDP, 14% of total employment, and 15% of the state's sales tax collection. As you can imagine, in 2020, because of the pandemic, that took a hit. However, Florida utilized federal funding, ARP, to supplement its educational programs because of that dip in the tourist dollars. Let's take a look at how other states receive their educational funding. So we're going to take a look at California. So California has revamped its school funding formula in ways that will send billions more dollars to districts to educate large numbers of children who are poor, disabled in some way, or still learning to speak English. So the local control funding formula was enacted in 2013, 2014, and it replaced the previous kindergarten through grade 12, K-12, finance system, which had been in existence for about 40 years. Though changing to the new system was not an easy sell, in the end, the old system was so convoluted that no one was willing to defend it. For school districts and charter schools, the local control funding formula establishes uniform grade span grants in place of the myriad previously existing K-12 funding streams, including revenue limits, general purpose block grants, and most state categorical programs. Full implementation of local control funding formula required additional funding allocations over a multi-year period and a transition formula to bridge the gap between prior funding levels and the new local control funding formula target levels. In 2018-2019, the Budget Act fully funded the local control funding formula gap, bridging all local education agencies to their local control funding formula target level. Local control funding formula is allocated through the California principal apportionment and is funded through a combination of local property taxes and state funding from the state school fund and education protection account. Now, of the three places where the funding comes from, let's take a look at how California directly correlates to where money is coming from in Florida. So first, we'll take a look at the target-based grant. So the target-based grant, the LCFF, which is the local control funding formula, establishes uniform per student based grants. This is almost the direct opposite of what happens in Florida. Florida's cost factors, expenditures don't operate at all the way that they do in California. Florida includes ESOL as a program cost factor. However, no such provision is made for economically disadvantaged students. Whereas in California, as you can see there, I don't like reading slides to people, but as you can see there, they have an additional 20% there for those students. Florida provides scholarship opportunities for students who are in foster care and or economically disadvantaged. You can see how that compares to California's, funding model there.
Okay, now that we've looked a little bit of case law and also a comparison between funding of Florida and California, let's take a closer look at funding within the state of Florida and whether or not the different districts in the state of Florida are fairly funded relative to other districts in the state of Florida. So this has been an ongoing spot of contention for many districts who feel that they are not being adequately funded. The state of Florida has developed within its constitution a statement about what's called adequate provision. And basically that means that the legislature must make reasonable efforts to ensure that all of the districts within the state of Florida receive adequate funding for education. So one example of adequate funding for education or adequate provisions is regarding class size, and I'll go into that in just a minute. But let's take a little bit of a closer look at adequate provision and see what it actually means for taxpayers. Okay, enshrined in the state constitution of Florida is the following statement. Adequate provision shall be made by law for a uniform, efficient, safe, secure, and high-quality system of free public schools that allow students to obtain a high-quality education. I don't think that any districts in the state of Florida would argue against the idea of establishing safe and secure and high-quality schools. Everybody wants that. I think the debate that is ongoing and will probably remain ongoing for quite some time is whether adequate provision has truly provided an opportunity for uniformity of schools throughout the state. So are all districts within the state of Florida funded in such a way that they are all enjoying the same high quality level of education? So we're going to take a look at equity at the state level versus equity at the local level. Okay, because certain districts in the state of Florida do not have as many folks in the tax base who are paying into the taxes based upon property taxes, et cetera, the state of Florida has established something called the Sparsity Supplement. The Sparsity Supplement was initiated in 1975, and this is a supplemental allocation for which approximately half of the districts in the state of Florida receive, and basically states that if you qualify based upon the number of individuals in your district who are attending school, it could possibly infuse additional funding to counties, again, with smaller populations or smaller student bodies. And this is in an effort to bring forth educational offerings that are to scale with some of the more populated districts. The Sparsity Supplement, I think, is actually in response to what's known as the District Cost Differential, or DCD. Okay, the uniformity of education that the state of Florida aspires to is pretty complex. Because different districts have different costs of living, different rates of pay for district employees, the state of Florida has developed a district cost differential, which assigns value to districts essentially based upon whether it is more or less expensive to live and work in that district compared to other districts in the state. So the average for the state is 1.0. The more expensive districts are going to fall above 1.0, and districts that are less expensive to live in or don't pay quite as high would be in the less than 1.0 category. Of course, this creates a conflict. Even though it appears logical that districts that are more expensive should receive a greater amount of funding to compensate for higher cost of living, it is often the case that districts with a lower DCD, that is below 1.0, face more significant financial hurdles, again, due to like lower property values and thus fewer dollars going into the tax base. Often the more populated, economically stratified counties like St. Johns County or Martin County in the South have a higher district cost differential and then collect a bigger portion of funding based upon the DCD. And again, the state of Florida created a Sparsity Supplement to kind of offset that. So the district cost differential is calculated using something called the Florida Price Level Index, which basically serves as a basis for calculating the DCD. It's a wage index that is used for understanding how much personnel are paid across the state of Florida. When the DCD is calculated, it uses 3 years of the FLPI to establish a number. Remember, that's 1.0 being the average for the DCD. So the higher the DCD, again, the higher the factor in calculating base funding. This helps districts with higher DCDs and harms districts with lower DCDs. So for Polk County, you'll see that our weighted FTE was 118,795. And our base student allocation, or BSA, is roughly $4,400, but our DCD is below 1.0. So that has a downward impact on our base funding. So our DCD was 0.9683. So multiplying that by the base student allocation and also the weighted FTE gives us a base funding of $503,014,999. Okay, here are a couple of scatter plots just so you can get a better sense of the Florida price level indicator compared to the district cost differential. So what you'll see is the DCD tends to go up commensurate with an increase within the FLPI. So each one of these dots represents a district within the state of Florida. And you'll see that the districts with the lower Florida price level indicators are also lower in the district cost differential. So the base funding here is expected to be a little bit lower because they fall below 1.0 DCD. FLPI is not directly related to household income, but it is somewhat related. If you can, you'll see a little bit of a trend here. There is an upward trend, although there are definitely outliers. The FLPI compared to median household income. So again, the higher the median household income, typically the higher FLPI. Okay, taking a look here, our district cost differential versus population by Florida school district. I don't know if you'll be able to see this particular circle. I think you may. Okay, here we are in Polk County. We have a population of just below 750,000. Our DCD is 0.9683. That puts us at as the lowest DCD of the 10 most populous districts within Florida. So quite frankly, we feel that puts us at a slight disadvantage compared to these other highly populated districts within the state of Florida. So again, that's having that lower DCD that's below 1.0 is pushing our base funding, our base allocation down. Here's another visual to help you better understand where Polk County falls within the state of Florida. So these numbers here, 17, 19, 19, 9, and 3 represent the total number of counties within each division. So we have, these are 20th percentile, 40th, 60th, 80th, and then upwards to the 100th percentile. These are the districts with the highest DCD here. These districts are the lowest. Polk County falls right here. We are in the bottom 40%. Looks like we're just above the bottom 30th percentile. So again, we're at a 0.9683 DCD. Okay, just a quick takeaway if you're not going to remember much. I know that this has been a fairly complex presentation, but probably the most important thing to know regarding the DCD is that if you are at 1.0 or above, it's going to exert an upward pressure on your base funding. For Polk County, because our DCD is 0.9683, it has a downward pressure on our funding. If we are at 1.0, our base funding would have been a little bit more, but because we're at 0.9683, our base funding is $503,014,999. We also do not receive a sparsity supplement, and so that sets us at a further disadvantage. So let's zoom out a little bit and just take a look at the state of Florida in general, compared to funding in other states in the United States. So how do we, as a state, compare to other states within the US regarding our education funding? Where do we lie? Well, we lie pretty much at the bottom. With the per pupil funding rate at nearly $4,500, and I know you can't see this very well, but Florida is right here. We only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 states below Florida that fund their students less than we do. So if we're looking at the average of approximately 16,000 or so, I believe that is, all of these states here fund at a lower rate, and all of these states here fund at a much higher rate. If you can see this little X here, 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 and here, these are all states that do not have state income taxes. So we enjoy in Florida the fact that we do not have a state income tax, but there may be a little bit of a trend. It seems like the majority of states that have less funding for their students also do not have state income tax. And probably one of the more concerning trends that I've noted, this is per pupil spending rate for all students within the state compared to the national average. Let's also take a look at the disparities between per pupil funding in the higher poverty districts and the lower poverty districts. So on average, the state of Florida's funding for students at the higher poverty levels and then the lower poverty levels is very broad. Okay, so that means that other than Florida, we have approximately 7 states that have a wider disparity between funding for the highest poverty and the lowest poverty districts. I think as a state, we should probably be looking at 2 factors. First is, are we comfortable being close to the bottom in terms of overall funding for our students for per pupil expenditures? That's the first concern. And the second concern is, are we comfortable being one of the states with the highest disparity between per pupil funding in higher poverty districts compared to lower poverty districts? So I will leave you with that as a comparison between the federal and the state comparisons for the state of Florida and the United States. Again, we just have a couple of pages of references here. And thank you. That now concludes our presentation.